In this episode, we're going to focus on external requirements, because many beginners assume governance is mostly an internal leadership preference, when in reality the outside world constantly reshapes what an enterprise must prioritize and what it must prove. External requirements include laws, regulations, contractual commitments, industry expectations, and even shifting public trust norms that can change how an organization is allowed to operate. When leaders treat these requirements as background noise, governance becomes reactive, and the enterprise gets surprised by audits, penalties, customer demands, or reputational damage that feels sudden but was actually predictable. When leaders identify external requirements early and integrate them into governance, the enterprise can make decisions with confidence because obligations are treated as design inputs rather than as last-minute obstacles. This topic matters because governance of enterprise IT, GEIT, is judged by how well it steers enterprise behavior under real-world constraints, and external requirements are among the strongest constraints an enterprise will ever face. By the end, you should be able to explain what external requirements are, how they differ from internal requirements, and how they change governance priorities, controls, and accountability. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to define external requirements in a way that avoids narrow thinking. External requirements are obligations and expectations that originate outside the enterprise and still carry consequences inside the enterprise, even if the enterprise did not choose them. Some are formal, like laws and regulations that must be followed to avoid fines or operational restrictions. Others are contractual, like commitments made to customers, partners, and vendors that can trigger financial penalties or lawsuits if violated. Others are industry-driven, like requirements imposed by payment networks or sector regulators, which can determine whether the organization is allowed to do business. There are also market and societal expectations, such as customer trust demands around privacy and security, which may not be written as laws, but can still cause severe harm when violated. For beginners, it helps to think of external requirements as rules and expectations that travel with the enterprise wherever it goes, shaping what is acceptable and what is risky. In governance, these requirements reshape priorities because leaders must ensure the enterprise can demonstrate compliance and manage external scrutiny. External requirements also increase the need for evidence because external parties often require proof, not promises. It is also important to understand how external requirements differ from internal requirements because the difference influences how governance treats them. Internal requirements are chosen by the enterprise to support its strategy and operational discipline, and they can be adjusted when leadership decides to change direction. External requirements are not negotiable in the same way because they come with enforcement mechanisms that the enterprise cannot ignore. Even when an enterprise disagrees with a regulation, it still must comply or accept the consequences, which may include fines, loss of licenses, or forced changes. Contractual requirements are somewhat negotiable at the moment of contract negotiation, but once a contract is signed, they become binding obligations that governance must manage. Industry requirements may be voluntary in theory, but in practice they are mandatory if the enterprise wants to participate in that industry ecosystem. Market expectations may not have a courtroom behind them, but they can be enforced by customers leaving, partners refusing to integrate, or investors losing confidence. This difference matters because governance must treat external requirements as boundary conditions, not as preferences, and it must embed them into decision criteria and oversight. Beginners who learn this distinction can better diagnose why certain controls and reporting expectations exist. External requirements reshape governance priorities because they often elevate certain risks from tolerable to unacceptable. For instance, an enterprise might be willing to accept a certain level of service downtime internally, but a regulated environment might require stronger continuity and reporting, making reliability a governance priority. An enterprise might be comfortable with informal data handling practices internally, but privacy laws can require structured data controls, making data governance and evidence collection a top governance obligation. Contracts might require specific response times for incidents, forcing governance to prioritize operational readiness even if the business would otherwise focus on new features. External requirements can also change the order in which improvements must happen because regulatory deadlines and audit cycles impose timelines that do not always match internal planning. Governance must therefore adjust priorities in a way that protects the enterprise from external consequences while still advancing enterprise strategy. This is not a choice between compliance and business goals, because failing externally can destroy the ability to pursue any goals at all. Effective governance balances these forces by integrating external requirements into the same decision system that allocates resources and monitors outcomes. One major category of external requirement is legal and regulatory obligation, and beginners should understand that these obligations often focus on how the enterprise handles information, money, and critical services. Privacy laws may define what the enterprise must disclose, how consent works, how data must be protected, and what rights individuals have over their data. Financial regulations may require controls around transactions, record retention, fraud prevention, and oversight of third parties. Sector regulations, such as those affecting healthcare or critical infrastructure, may impose requirements for availability, reporting, and resilience that shape technology architecture and operational practices. These legal and regulatory obligations force governance to define ownership and accountability for compliance outcomes, because regulators expect the enterprise to have responsible parties, not vague shared responsibility. They also force governance to define how compliance is monitored continuously, because periodic audits are not enough when external scrutiny can occur after an incident. For beginners, the important idea is that regulations do not just add checklists. They change governance itself by raising the importance of evidence, oversight, and formal decision rights. When you see scenarios that mention regulators, audits, or legal exposure, think of governance priorities shifting toward demonstrable control and traceable accountability. A second major category is contractual requirements, which often come from customers, partners, insurers, and outsourced service agreements. Contracts can include commitments about service availability, incident notification timelines, data handling, audit rights, and security expectations. Many enterprises discover too late that the contract they sign creates obligations they are not prepared to meet, such as providing certain reports or responding to incidents within a defined window. Governance must therefore treat contracts as external requirements that reshape obligations, because a contract turns expectations into enforceable commitments. This is especially important when the enterprise provides digital services, because customers increasingly demand proof of security and reliability as part of doing business. Contractual requirements also force governance to coordinate across teams, because a contract may require legal, compliance, security, and operations to act together, and governance must ensure ownership is clear. For beginners, it helps to realize that contracts can function like customized regulations, because they can impose specific requirements that are more demanding than general laws. Governance must integrate these obligations into decision criteria, such as vendor selection and service design, to avoid signing commitments that cannot be delivered. A third category is industry and ecosystem requirements, which can reshape governance even when the government is not directly involved. Payment card ecosystems, for example, impose standards that enterprises must meet to process payments safely, and those standards can require specific controls and evidence practices. Industry associations and certification expectations can also drive requirements, especially in fields where trust and reliability are central to the business model. Customers and partners may require recognized assurance practices before they share data or integrate systems, effectively turning assurance into an external requirement for market participation. These ecosystem requirements matter because they can change competitive position. An enterprise that cannot meet them may lose deals even if it is technically capable of delivering a product. Governance, therefore, must treat external expectations as part of enterprise direction, because market access and trust are strategic assets. For beginners, it is useful to think of industry requirements as the price of entry to certain markets, and governance is how the enterprise ensures it can pay that price consistently. This also explains why governance often emphasizes standardization and repeatability, because external ecosystems tend to demand consistent evidence and consistent control behavior. External requirements also reshape governance by increasing the importance of third-party oversight, because external obligations often still apply even when the enterprise outsources work. If a vendor processes sensitive data, the enterprise remains accountable for privacy obligations, even if the vendor caused the failure. If a cloud provider supports critical operations, the enterprise is still responsible for ensuring service commitments and resilience expectations are met, even if the infrastructure is outside its direct control. This creates governance obligations around vendor selection, contracting, monitoring, and evidence gathering, because external parties may require the enterprise to prove that third parties are controlled appropriately. Governance must therefore assign ownership for third-party risk and ensure that vendor performance is reviewed as part of operating rhythm. For beginners, the key idea is that outsourcing does not outsource accountability, and external requirements make that reality unavoidable. This is why governance must include processes to verify third-party controls and to ensure contracts include necessary rights and evidence access. When scenarios mention vendors, shared services, or outsourced operations, external requirements often explain why governance must be more rigorous and more evidence-driven. Another way external requirements reshape governance is by changing what evidence must exist and how quickly it must be produced. Internal requirements may allow informal verification and occasional reviews, but external requirements often demand documented proof that can withstand scrutiny. Regulators and auditors may require evidence that controls were not only designed but consistently operated, which forces governance to build evidence generation into normal processes. Contracts may require reporting within certain time windows, forcing governance to ensure data about incidents and performance can be produced reliably. Customers may request assurance evidence during procurement, forcing governance to maintain a steady state of readiness rather than preparing only when asked. Evidence demands also reshape priorities because the enterprise must invest in the ability to monitor and demonstrate compliance, not merely in the ability to perform the work. Beginners sometimes treat evidence as paperwork, but in governance, evidence is how the enterprise proves it is trustworthy and compliant, which directly affects its ability to operate. When evidence is missing, external requirements become crises, because the enterprise cannot prove its behavior even if it was responsible. Governance makes evidence a routine output of operations, so external scrutiny does not destabilize the enterprise. External requirements can also reshape governance by making certain decisions more centralized or more formal than they would otherwise be. In a lightly regulated environment, an enterprise might allow business units to make many local choices, but external compliance obligations often require consistent standards across the enterprise, especially for data handling and security practices. This can push governance towards stronger enterprise-level authority for certain decision areas, such as approving exceptions to security standards or defining data classification and retention requirements. External requirements also tend to increase the need for formal risk acceptance, because accepting certain risks may violate obligations or create legal exposure. That means governance must ensure risk acceptance decisions are made by the proper authority and documented, which often requires structured decision forums and escalation paths. Beginners sometimes see this as unnecessary bureaucracy, but external enforcement changes the consequences of informal decisions. When consequences are high, formality becomes protective rather than obstructive. Governance must right-size that formality so decision speed remains workable, but it cannot pretend external scrutiny does not exist. In exam scenarios, when a regulated environment is described, stronger formal governance mechanisms are often the correct direction. A beginner-friendly skill is learning how to identify external requirements from the clues in a scenario, because questions rarely list every regulation or contract explicitly. Clues include references to regulated data, audits, compliance findings, customer demands for proof, penalties for downtime, and vendor obligations that include security reporting. Clues also include references to operating in multiple countries, because cross-border operations often introduce more complex privacy and record retention obligations. Another clue is operating in a sector where safety, health, or financial integrity is central, because external oversight tends to be stricter and consequences higher. When you recognize these cues, you can infer that governance priorities must include stronger control discipline, stronger evidence readiness, and clearer accountability. This is not about guessing the name of a regulation. It is about understanding that external requirements shift the governance posture from optional good practice to mandatory operational discipline. Beginners often worry about not knowing every law, but governance questions usually reward reasoning about obligations and evidence rather than memorizing specific legal text. The practical outcome is that you learn to respond to external pressure by strengthening governance mechanisms rather than by improvising ad hoc fixes. External requirements also create the need for structured change management at the governance level, because changes can introduce compliance gaps and external consequences. When obligations exist, the enterprise must ensure that changes to systems, processes, and vendors do not silently violate requirements or weaken controls. Governance does this by ensuring that certain types of changes trigger additional review and by ensuring that evidence is updated as part of normal change activity. This does not mean every change becomes slow, but it does mean governance defines thresholds so high-impact changes receive appropriate oversight. For example, changes that affect regulated data flows may require review of privacy and security implications, while routine low-risk changes can follow standardized paths. External requirements also increase the need for exception management, because sometimes constraints force temporary deviations, but those deviations must be documented, owned, and tracked to prevent permanent drift into noncompliance. Beginners may think exceptions are only internal decisions, but external obligations often define which exceptions are unacceptable and which require explicit approval. Governance provides the structure to make change safe under external scrutiny, so the enterprise can evolve without constantly risking violations. In scenario questions, when changes repeatedly cause compliance issues, strengthening governance thresholds and evidence integration is often the right response. Another important theme is that external requirements can evolve, which means governance must maintain awareness and adaptability rather than relying on a one-time compliance effort. Laws can change, regulatory guidance can shift, industry expectations can rise, and customer procurement standards can become stricter as the market matures. Governance must therefore include mechanisms to monitor changes in external obligations and to update internal requirements, policies, and controls accordingly. This is not about chasing every trend, but about having a disciplined way to assess relevance, impact, and urgency. Adaptability also means updating decision criteria so that new obligations are considered during investment planning and vendor selection rather than being discovered late. For beginners, the key point is that external requirements are not static, and governance must treat them like a moving environment that requires periodic review. This is one reason operating rhythm matters, because governance needs regular checkpoints where external changes can be considered and translated into internal action. When a scenario mentions new regulations or expanding into new markets, the best governance answer often includes establishing a process to identify and integrate new external requirements proactively. That proactive posture is a hallmark of mature governance. To close, identifying external requirements that reshape governance priorities and obligations means recognizing the laws, regulations, contracts, industry standards, and market expectations that impose non-negotiable boundaries on how the enterprise can operate. These external requirements often elevate certain risks, demand stronger evidence, and require clearer accountability, which shifts governance priorities toward consistent standards, formal decision rights, and routine oversight. They also increase the importance of third-party governance because accountability remains with the enterprise even when work is outsourced. External requirements influence scope by defining which domains must be governed tightly, influence authority by requiring that high-impact decisions and risk acceptances are made by the right leaders, and influence operating rhythm by forcing continuous readiness rather than occasional scramble. When you learn to spot external requirement clues in scenarios, you can respond with governance actions that integrate obligations into decision criteria, controls, and evidence generation, rather than treating compliance as an after-the-fact cleanup. In the next episode, we will build on this by embedding strategic planning into governance, so IT direction stays on mission. Because external and internal requirements only stay manageable when planning and oversight are integrated into the governance system.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.